Everybody, and welcome to Bible Study That Doesn't Suck. It's great to see you all. Sorry for the hiatus. I got pneumonia and it was terrible. I'm Pastor Megan Rohrer at Grace Lutheran in San Francisco. You can learn more about us at www.gracesf.com. We're worshiping at Christ Church Lutheran this week, though, so don't come visit us in person.
You're worshiping somewhere else? That's kind of cool. I am Pastor Dan Tisdale. I am not recovering from pneumonia. I am the pastor of St. Mark's Lutheran in Roswell, New Mexico. Yes, that Roswell. Though I've learned recently that a lot of people under a certain age don't know what Roswell is famous for, which is sad to me.
Yeah.
Just sad. Anyway, so we have worship at 10:15 on Sunday, and yeah, lots of stuff going on. Our website and Facebook page are both stmarksroswell.org and on Facebook. So come and check us out. Yep.
Good work. That's a lot of things. And today there are the readings for Sunday are very interesting. It begins with Genesis chapter 45, and Dan and I were having an argument about it before we pushed record, and we thought you might appreciate seeing our argument about it. But the story of Joseph is what is taking place. Joseph was sold into slavery by his brothers, and they told their dad that he was dead. And so they took money off of putting their brother in a terrible situation. In this circumstance, I believe it's either a couple verses before this or a couple verses after this. The reconciliation between Joseph and his brothers is not to say, I'm sorry. There is no I'm sorry said in this story. They weep on each other. That's how I don't know if they reconcile, but that's how they meet. They're meeting at a time when Joseph is in power. He had a bunch of dreams about there being a lack of food and droughts, and he is the person who is in charge of divvying out food during the famine. And he ends up being a very well-respected, powerful person kind of in the Pharaoh's court. And so in this context, Dan was arguing that this is a beautiful sign of love because Joseph says, what was it?
Joseph says, I forgive you for what you've done, and I'm going to give you a land where you can you'd have food and not go through the famine, and we can all love, and we'll be nearer to each other, and we can visit, and we can have cups of coffee in the morning and
love
on each other.
And I think that's hooey. I think Joseph is lying. I think Joseph is pretending things are fine because he's fancy and they're in poverty. And so Joseph uses his great power, and he makes sure that they don't continue in poverty, right? So he provides them with a baseline. But I don't see anything about hanging out later. I see them weeping after that.
It's implied.
Sure. Coffee maybe was awesome back then, and so they had to. But I'm pretty sure people just barely scraping above poverty don't get to hang out with people in the Pharaoh's court very often. What I think is happening here is there's a sketch on Saturday Night Live, I don't know if anyone saw it, where Chuck Schumer and Nancy Pelosi are trying not to brag that they won in the budget talks, and they're not very good at it. They end up laughing a lot about how they won the budget talks. And I think what's happening here is that Joseph is trying to be the bigger person where he doesn't go, haha, I'm fancy, you're not, because he doesn't have to say it. It's such a gross disparity between them socioeconomically. What I think is cool about this is that it's the person being bullied in the most terribly unimaginable way, right? Sold into slavery, the worst. That person still is able to rise to do good things. And then when they are in a position to care for the other people in return, they provide kind of the bare minimum of it, but they don't he doesn't make the brothers financial dealers and doesn't make them a part of the government, right? They get to be off over here, safe and fed. And so it's like when everyone teases you in high school, and now that you're fancy, everyone is your best friend. And so that's what I read into us, and it's not just because everyone made fun of me in high school and now they want to be my best friend.
Everybody made fun of me in high school too, so that's not an excuse.
Yeah.
I was that kid.
No, I haven't said something awkward yet. I have to turn it over to you after I make you answer for something awkward.
Oh, I'm sorry. Go ahead. Yes. I'm ready.
This is how Bible study that doesn't suck works. Okay, you ready?
I know.
So, Dan,
yeah.
Is what you would preached in churches that even though someone puts you in slavery, it's okay and you should just love them despite slavery. They shouldn't repent.
I think what I would preached is when someone has attained a position of power, that they use it for the good of all people, and that's love and forgiveness. And I think that's what's going on here. I think did they have a relationship? I don't know. I think the very last verse of the passage we use says, you mentioned, and he kissed all his brothers and wept upon them, and then says, and after that his brothers talked with him. There's a part of the story earlier on where he could have sent his own emissaries to talk with them, and instead he didn't do that. He went and spoke to them directly. He sort of
recognize them, and he had to say, "I'm your brother."
Right, but he didn't have to go at all. So I think he's making an effort to not. I think he's making an effort to make that relationship, despite the difference in position and power. He's using his power to help them, but he could have done that anonymously. He could have done that separately, and by making that relationship, he's breaking down those walls with what he's able to do, forgiving them for what happened in the past. And I think, and I tend to do this, so I'm not going to do this directly, but I like to connect all the passages for the week. And I think all of the passages have to do with different ways of expressing love. Luke is pretty obvious. I mean, Luke is, love your neighbor, love your enemy, kind of, that's the kind of passage we're at. And Corinthians has its own thing. This is, maybe it's not, maybe the relationship is, to be fair, I don't think the relationship is ever going to be totally healed. But I think Joseph is doing the best he can with what he's got, with his position of power. And I think there is forgiveness there. Yeah.
Well, so this might not surprise you to learn, but this was the text, one of the texts chosen for the service when LGBT people were reconciled into the Lutheran Church.
I didn't know that.
Yeah. It got a unanimous vote from the people participating in the rite, but maybe not a unanimous vote from the synod members, but we picked it anyway. Because that was an instance where people didn't get an apology, where a lot of people in the LGBTQ movement took their own lives or died before they got to see that day. I think because it's slavery and because of the history in the United States, you have to talk about the seriousness and the continued economic effects that families have due to slavery. This is a particular story of someone who ended up on the good side of it, or whatever that means.
That's rare, but that's rare.
Yeah, rare, but I think some people would still argue that the effects of that stigmatization still affects you neurologically and emotionally, even if you do rise above, because Joseph doesn't have entire agency over how they're acting in the world. And the good news of this story is that Joseph doesn't use the oppressor's tools. Joseph doesn't sell his brothers into slavery. Joseph rises into power and then demonstrates a different kind of leadership once you get there. And I think too often in our world, when people who have long been oppressed are put into positions of power, because there aren't a lot of alternative examples, there can be times when people use the tools that oppressed them to get revenge on people who had held them down. The difficulty is, as someone who has a large number of privileges, I can't decide that other people should be the first ones to be the ones to be kinder to those who treated them, right? So it's kind of like in PhD work, there's a lot of the process that feels like it's hazing. Like, I had to do this when I got my PhD, so you have to do this too. And it's hard to know who can be the first one to kind of step out of those systems of injustice.
Right.
But well, I do think the Luke text provides maybe an opportunity for that, because if you combine today's reading, which is about loving your enemies and being kinder to them than they have been to you, it comes out of this statement from the Gospel of Mark that says, whatever measurement you have to measure other people is the measurement that God is going to use on you. So if you harshly condemn other people and point out all their flaws, then that's the way God's going to see you. If you are really loosey-goosey with people and you don't point out other people's flaws, then God's going to like accept you fully because you got your own issues. And so, but what I love about the Luke text is that prior to this, Jesus is speaking some truth to power, right? Jesus is almost sassy. And you have to know that Roman soldiers probably were around when Jesus is talking about people exploiting others, and particularly exploiting people because you have way more of them and way more money than them and way more resources and way more power than them. And so this text with Jesus, I wish was read in the whole instead of being divided into two, because when it's just read as love your enemies, without the opportunity to call people into repentance, or without the opportunity of asking people to right systems of injustice, it appears that Jesus is saying all behaviors are fine, just love people. And what's really happening in the 6th chapter of Luke is that Jesus is saying all are welcome, God loves everyone, but not all behaviors are welcome. You can't participate in systematic injustice. You can't make people who have just lost their husband participate in sex work because there's no other economic options for them. He says it nicer in a lot better poetry, but he sticks it to them before he says, turn the other cheek.
Well, I think it goes, I want to quickly go back to the Joseph, because I think it ties in. There is a big difference, and I think sometimes we, in our own English lexicon, we don't give this enough credit, that there's a huge, big difference between forgiveness and reconciliation. Forgiveness is great, like forgiveness is wonderful, but forgiveness is for one or the other party to be at peace, maybe. It's not going back to the history. It's not for Joseph. It's not going back to what you did was wrong and working through those things. Forgiveness is for Joseph to be able to say, I'm okay moving on, right? But I don't know why I thought of what they actually called it, what did they call it? Truth and Reconciliation, South Africa did. Mm-hmm. It went out of their way to basically say everybody was wrong. And that sounds like a weird thing to say. Well, the people in power are wrong, but even the people that were oppressed, everybody forgave everybody, but there was reconciliation. That they went out of the way to say, here's all the things that were done, good and bad, and by all the people involved, let's admit that we did those things and let's try to move forward. So they went beyond forgiveness, they went to reconciliation. And where I'll agree with you is I don't know that there was reconciliation between Joseph and his brothers. Right. But I think within what you said about with Jesus talking about the behaviors, what he's saying is forgiveness is great, but it's not quite enough. You have to own up. So Jesus is taking an extra step beyond what happened in the story with Joseph. Jesus is saying it's great to love, but you can't just love out of power or you have to go back and have it be something that you grow from it, not just that you commit those same errors again in the future, basically.
Yeah.
And so there's reconciliation, you do have to look at the greater context, the Beatitudes that are before and some of the section that's after. I don't know how long this passage goes officially, to 38. Because there are the whole chapter is about that.
Yeah.
It is about a very radical love. I mean, just love your enemies is a pretty radical statement to begin with. Right. But it's I think you have to look at it as which is it putting the cart before the horse in which way? Like, right. It's difficult to just love your enemies. Well, I'm just gonna love them right now. Do you have to have reconciliation first, or there has to be other things involved? Right. You don't just love your enemies. There has to be other pieces. So it becomes more radical when you look at the bigger picture of what he's really talking about.
And the First Corinthians text is loaded with a lot of things that Christians have injured other people with in their speaking. So there's bits in this text that have uplifted anti-Semitism. This idea of the old Adam and the new Adam, that things must die so that the new may come, has been used to try to eradicate Jewish people, to say that the new Adam is here, and so we have to get rid of the old Adam. That's unacceptable. Anti-Semitism is unacceptable in all of its forms. There is language in here that has led to dividing the spiritual body from the physical body, and there have been ways in which there have been a lot of unfortunate consequences of Christian language that is about ignoring your body, ignoring your sexuality, ignoring your heart, and not uplifting the ways in which the sensuality of our bodies in New Testament, or in the Hebrew Testament, is really lifted up, like talking about a God who brings you raisin cakes, not just cakes, but raisin cakes, because God wants you to feel good inside of your body. And so this First Corinthians text, while it can be about a way to talk about what's going to happen in Lent and Easter, I think it provides us with one of the first times we can, in our preaching, name things that have been done incorrectly, apologize for them, and model reconciliation in the world. One of the ways that we're going to do that at Grace Lutheran is on March 23rd at 3 p.m., we're having a Me Too service, and we're going to name the ways that pastors in the past of our congregation have taken advantage of women sexually. We're also going to name ways in which our church has participated in some of the larger systematic injustices. That's a part of our intentional Lenten work, to name ways that we have believed in the past that we were following the path of God, and we're working to kind of reconcile ourselves to be better into the future. And if that kind of metamorphosis language about butterflies and rainbows is about owning what has been done and repenting and apologizing, particularly to those who are the most vulnerable and who have experienced these things, then I think that puts us on the step of doing what the Luke text is talking about and what's being modeled in the Genesis text. How to do forgiveness and reconciliation in the most extreme examples.
I also find that the Corinthians text, I think the Corinthians text at some level is about transformation, because it's talking about the temporal the body that we have right now, and I think that there's something about love and forgiveness and reconciliation is first of all that we only have so much time, right? We only have so much time on this planet, and it doesn't help us to hold to hate and to help cause divisions between people. And our life is very temporary, and that's not God's will for us. But I think also that there's something about if we are able to reconcile with people over differences, then there's a transformation, not just of us, but of entire communities of people.
Yes. One fun thing that I want to say before Dan has to leave is that Someone once told me that the understanding in the Hebrew of what the word dust means is that it means bits of God. And as we get closer to Ash Wednesday, the idea that we are from the dust and to the dust we shall return, that a really deep and cool way of thinking about that is to think about we are all bits of God, and to God we shall return. Right. And particularly thinking about each of us being unique children of God, this idea of being dust just gives a good opportunity to kind of talk about all of the unique incarnations of God that each of us have within our body.
I did an impromptu funeral for a high schooler who died in a car accident. I did it around just after New Year's. She died just after Christmas, and I kept coming back to, we believe very strongly. I mean, one of the mottos of our denomination is God's work, our hands. We believe very strongly that God works through us. And I was preaching to a group of people that probably the majority were not churchgoers, and I said, we believe that God works through us, through our hands and our feet and our eyes and our ears. And so in a time of this great grief, you all need to be God to each other. Mm-hmm. Because God is with you. This idea that you sort of brought up, that we don't wait for God to bless us. We bless each other in the name of God. And how vitally important that is. I think one of the messiest things of modern Christianity is this idea of if we just wait long enough, or we just give a little, then when we go to heaven we'll be blessed. I'm like, that's not how the exchange rate works. Mm-hmm. That sort of blessing is supposed to happen now. We aren't sitting here, racking up a treasury that we're going to go cash in when we're gone from here. We are racking up a treasury so that we can spend it here on earth in these ways of loving each other and reconciling with other people and being God for each other. We can't afford not to. I mean, I don't believe, and I think that there's a lot of ways Christianity looks right now are centered on that sort of future bank account kind of transaction, and I don't think that's healthy. Yeah. So I think there's a little bit of that in Corinthians as well, and certainly Luke, about we need to love now, we need to forgive now, we need to work to reconcile now, because that's what's important. Not storing up some kind of treasures, storing up treasures in heaven. Right. That's great, wonderful if you do that, but that's not who we're called to be.
And I think the Psalm 37 sort of hints at that. I think this idea of retributive justice, the idea that God's going to get you because you got other people, or it's kind of like the notion of karma, like you're going to get it in the end because you were bad. And there's a lot of ideas about how the end of the world is going to be about God, like sticking it to people, and that bad things are going to happen to them because they did bad things on earth. And what I kind of think is, what if those are offerings to people who can't let it go unless someone gives it to people who are mean to them, right? And what if it gets you to stop continuing the cycle of rage and violence and anger long enough that you realize that there's another way that you can be life focused and focused on positivity and focused on hope and joy in the world. If the promise that someday someone's going to get it helps you leave it alone, wouldn't that be great if that's all that happens? Because it got you to refocus on something else. And I think sometimes we just need to refocus. And what I'll sometimes say to people is, like, imagining that bad things happen to someone else is not illegal. Doing something bad to someone else, right? And so know that the Bible imagines bad things happening to other people so that they can, like, get their crap together and behave when they're in person with someone. And so if you have thought, I'm not a good enough Christian because I don't always think wonderful thoughts about everyone, know that the Bible is full of people who also needed to vent.
So it's okay when someone cuts me off the interstate to think horrible things about them.
Yeah, and to honk and to swear, but it's bad if your 5 and 6-year-old are in the back seat, because then they will swear when they are frustrated.
Well, in my case, I don't have a 5 and 6-year-old, but
That's right. But what I wanted to leave people with is just know that if you've been through something so horrible it's hard to forgive and all you can do is weep, that there are stories in the Bible that are about that. If you are so angry you can only imagine revenge, there are stories in the Bible about that. If you use the wrong words and it is misread, and ideas about old Adams and new Adams, you just meant to have a metaphor of things getting better in the future. If you're someone who screws things up in your words, there's stories that are that in the Bible. And if you are working towards loving people so that you don't use the oppressor's tools once you are liberated and find yourself in a place of power, then there's a lot of people who struggled with that too. And so I encourage you to never let people tell you that God can't love you, to always know that the characters in the Bible probably are as unique and imperfect as you might be willing to admit that you are, and know that no one can ever take away God's love from you, no matter how many people vote, no matter what a fancy person in a robe says, that God's relationship with you is God's relationship with you. You are specks of dust, meaning you are bits of God, and that can't be siphoned out of you or separated. But
amen.
Yeah, thank you for joining us, everyone. Have fun at your next thing, Dan.
Thanks. See ya.
Bye.